Just to give you a little bit of background knowledge of Jonah Warren, he is an associate professor of game design and development at, I'm going to try and say this correctly, Quinnipiac University. I think I got that right.
Right.
Hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah.
His games have been exhibited at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
And also in the museum in Holon in Israel and the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. And also that includes the British Library and the Somerset House in London. His installation work has been featured in Wired magazine and Adobe magazines as well, at Art Basel Miami and Chelsea Museum, and also on the Discovery Channel. So Jonah has a lot of experience whenever it comes to game design, and I'm extremely excited to have him here with us today. So please give us a warm welcome for Jonah Warren as he starts off day two of CSGC.
Thank you very much.
Hello, I am Jonah Warren, Associate Professor of Game Design and Development at Quinnipiac University in Hamden, Connecticut. Our program has been around for about 8 years. We pride ourselves in giving students well-rounded educations in games while also kind of offering a bunch of different concentrations, including programming, design process, game art, game audio, business of games, writing for games, and game audio. And you can find out more at games.qu.edu. So today I'll be talking about using small game engines as prototyping tools. Give me a second and I will pull up my slides. Okay, so to give you kind of an overall an idea of the overall structure of this presentation, I'll start with just some context. So I'll be kind of talking about a little bit about me, who I am, how I got interested in these tools, and then I'll go into kind of the description of each tool, talk a little bit about the creator and the history, explore each tool's design philosophy, look at their interface and some example code, and then finally define a lens that each tool can kind of help see game design through. For those who aren't familiar with Jesse Schell's book of lenses, you can think of a lens as just kind of a particular way of looking, or a particular perspective on viewing game development, the creation of games. So ultimately kind of defining these lenses can help kind of help kind of figure out what kind of games it's good at prototyping, and also if you're an educator, what kind of assignments the tool might be good for. And the tools I'll be looking at today are Twine, Bitsy, Puzzlescript, Ren'Py, Choicescript, and FlickGame. So who I am, first I'm a game designer. This is kind of a quick sampling of some of the games I made over the past 20 years. 2013, I made Full Body Games, which was a thesis project at Parsons School of Design, kind of exploring the potentials of computer vision in games. So this was kind of pre-Connect. So it was just kind of a video camera set up with a kind of white background, some background subtraction that would extract the silhouette, which was kind of superimposed with graphics, simple graphics. So I made a suite of kind of 5 different games exploring the potentials of that combination. 2016, I'm going to create Haiti. I was a programmer, worked with Game Lab and Global Kids, and that is a simulation game of playing a family of 5 in Haiti, making decisions about where to work, what to do with each family member over the course of 4 years, and then trying to get kind of the most education and health as possible. 2012, I created a mobile game with Steven Sanborn called Pangolin. This was kind of a physics platformer where you're bouncing a pangolin around a world, trying to collect coins and solve puzzles. More recently, I've been interested in kind of small local multiplayer games. So 2016, I created After Word, which is a game with 2 keyboards connected to the same computer, 2 to 4 keyboards actually, where each user is given an adjective, and then you're tasked with identifying the noun that you think most commonly follows that adjective, and then you're given a score based on given from like a database of 500 million words collected from TV, books, and magazines. And then in 2018, I created Sloppy Forgeries, which is a competitive painting game. Also two mice, one computer. And then most recently, Imitative Counterpoint, which is a VR musical instrument that I collaborated with Conrad Kaczmarek. And I've also done a fair amount of research on kind of game engines in the past. So in 2019, I published a paper entitled Tiny Online Game Engines, which was kind of just exploring this landscape. It seemed to be an emerging pattern of, these kind of small constrained game engines that you could create the games online, often exporting to HTML, which would kind of streamline the game design process by having like a very strict set of constraints that kind of affect not only the design process, but also the games, obviously the games published with it. So I kind of took over 5,000 games from itch.io, analyzed the metadata, and interviewed 160 game developers using these tools, kind of analyzed some data about what these game developers for each game engine looked like, where they were from, and a bunch of other things. And of course, I also teach. I've taught, the classes I've taught fall into a number of categories, but game development, game design, and game technology. And so this kind of exploration started from this one class called Game Design Tools and Process that I teach, where the goal of the course is try to kind of expand students' understanding of games, look at game design from a variety of perspectives, and try to kind of get students outside their comfort zones. And so I divided the course up into these 4 different challenges. And part of this was trying to figure out how to teach game design. I wanted it to be digitally oriented, but not programming heavy. So in kind of preparing, I started doing research into these tools that could kind of help facilitate that, and kind of came up with this growing list. So before jumping in, it's always good to define your terms. So what is a small online? What's a small game engine? And I kind of took my definition of a tiny online game engine and kind of like tweaked it. So small game engine is just a tool that allows designers to create small constrained games of a certain style or genre, often within a browser and often without programming. Small game engines, why small game engines? Well, first of all, game development can be very overwhelming. Anyone who's taught game development or has used, Unreal or Unity knows that these are extremely complex programs. There's just a lot of knowledge that it takes to kind of navigate them. And for a beginner, it can be a lot. And so, these tools are often free. They're easy to learn. They can run in a browser, so they're very accessible. And they often include editors for asset creation. So you don't need to learn another program just to create assets for your game. And of course, these constraints can also help enforce or give a new perspective on the game creation. So which ones did I choose? Well, part of it was, from exploring the tools available that would help facilitate that class and the different kind of lenses that I was looking for. I also looked at itch.io, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's just a platform for publishing games for indie developers. It's got over 170,000, probably more by now. And they have a nice list of most popular or most used engines. And so I kind of looked through that list and looked for the ones that weren't do-it-all engines, the ones that had more kind of constraints that were making a particular kind of game. And so of those, I chose Twine, Bitsy, Ren'Py, I found in Puzzlescript. So first up is Twine, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. So it was created in 2019 by Chris Kleines, who was an interaction fiction writer and design student at the time. It started as a free downloadable open source application for Mac and Windows for creating hypertext games. But in 2014, he released Twine 2.0, which allowed developers to kind of create games within the browser. And in most Twine games, player read passages, they make decisions by clicking on hyperlinks, which kind of allow them to find their own path through a narrative. On the right, we have Depression Quest by Zoe Quinn to kind of give you an idea of what a Twine game looks like, mostly just text with hyperlinks. And this ultimately, this game engine publishes, the final result is an HTML page. It's design philosophy. So for each one of these tools, I kind of try to find a quote from the game, the creator of these tools, to kind of get a sense of what their intent on creating this tool was. So Klimas describes his motivations as an attempt to make something that would be friendly to people who are writers more than coders. And that philosophy kind of permeates everything about Twine, from its interface to its vocabulary. Twine developers are called authors, who create stories which are made up of passages. There's no really mention of games or developers within its documentation. And even the interface itself kind of references analog tools familiar with, or techniques familiar with writers. So, this map interface shown here has these little passages that kind of look like, kind of emulate sticky notes often used with in the design process for writers. And the sample code is very simple here. This is just kind of a snippet of what a Twine code could look like. And ultimately, it's really can just be text, and then this kind of bracket notation for linking pieces of text to then titles or other passages. So this look down basically links to this look down passage over here. There's some extra curly brackets to get rid of white space, but ultimately the square brackets is pretty much all you need to get started. So, what's it good for? Well, obviously, great for prototyping stories. It's also good for, if you have a narrative assignment, if you're a teacher, it will definitely enforce that lens on your students. And, it can also, you should think about it, obviously for prototyping the narrative flow for a larger game. And it's actually been used for prototyping for other purposes. So there was an interactive episode of the TV show Black Mirror titled Bandersnatch. That was, so Twine was used for prototyping that debuted on Netflix in 2018. Next up, we have Bitsy, which was released by Adam Ledoux in 2017 on itch.io. So Bitsy is a tool for creating little pixelated worlds to explore. In most Bitsy games, the player moves an avatar through different rooms, kind of this top-down view, picking up things and talking to people. And on the right here, we have Flotsam by Mark Canicott. It kind of also gives you a sense of what Bitsy is about. It's got this kind of limited color palette, pixelated graphics, these 2-frame animations, and little snippets of text. And when asked why he created Bitsy, Ledoux said he wanted to stop worrying about programming details, screen resolutions, platform differences, and he wanted to be able to immediately work on the heart of what he was trying to create, a world with a story, which gives you a good sense of, what this is about, creating worlds, which can also be seen in Bitsy's interface here, which really tries to kind of reduce the friction in creating environments and creating worlds. Traditionally in exploration games, with kind of world creation in general, assets and making those assets is the most time-consuming part of the development process. And so Bitsy addresses that through these very, very tight constraints. So designers are limited to 3 colors, 8x8 sprites, and then 16x16 rooms of those sprites, and then 2 frames of animation. So those restrictions not only simplify the game, but the development process. So the interface, you can kind of squeeze a little animation editor underneath this paint window. So it's all very kind of compact and kind of easy to navigate. And then, this kind of tile set structure allows painters to just, or developers just kind of paint out their rooms really quickly. And the sample code for Bitsy doesn't really have much code. It's all pretty much through the interface, although in recent releases, Ledoux's kind of expanded some of the logic that was initially possible just within the dialog window to kind of include locking different rooms and kind of opening up with keys, that kind of standard gaming convention. And so the lens that Bitsy is great for is kind of focusing on world creation and facilitating exploration. So laying out space, again, creating your world from this top-down view. As if you're interested in using it for an assignment, students can practice quickly creating kind of a cohesive, believable world with consistent characters and some simple dialogue to kind of help fill out that world as well. It could be used for kind of conveying mood, concentrating on color palettes and evoking a certain feeling based on a created space. Next up is Puzzlescript, which was released by Stephen Lavelle in 2013. It's a little different from Bitsy and Twine in that its development is a little bit more exploratory and open-ended. It is also more programming oriented. So after a while back emailing with Lavelle, I kind of learned that he originally envisioned it as a tool to create games similar to ZZT, which was an ASCII action adventure game released for MS-DOS in 1991 by Tim Sweeney, now CEO of Epic Games. And so we started that process and then kind of later reimagined it as a tool for creating puzzle games after kind of embracing a rule set that was inspired by a Ludum Dare game called T in Y World that was released in 2012. The most concise definition I've heard is for Puzzlescript is like a tool for pushing stuff around games. So you're a player moving on a grid, pushing stuff around. And on the right, but within that kind of, there's a lot of possibilities. Just that's kind of its natural starting point. On the right, you can see a Puzzlescript game entitled Beam Islands by MJav, and it also ultimately publishes to HTML. So in the documentation for Puzzlescript, Lavelle says that when creating puzzle games, the barrier of entry is way higher than it needs to be. I've worked on a lot of puzzle games, and in creating Puzzlescript, I decided on a particular group of those that could be handily modeled with a scripting language. And so, this scripting language is the center of Puzzlescript, making it very different from the kind of interface-oriented Bitsy and Twine, which tries to hide any programming. So this is kind of front and center. And even the game assets themselves are created to kind of define within the script, within code. You can see on the left here, like the objects listed. We've got these kind of ASCII grids of zeros and ones, which are defining the colors and the actual sprites themselves. And so the interface for Puzzlescript is very limited, mostly just consisting of this editor viewing the game and then kind of a debugging console. So, although it embraces programming, it also tries to embrace simplicity. So, actually the rule set for Sokomon, a Japanese game, kind of puzzle game based on pushing crates onto targets, can be expressed in one line of Puzzlescript code seen here. So the idea here is that the engine has this kind of, it's kind of like a search and replace kind of feel to it. So this one line of code effectively means for the engine to kind of search every tile look for this kind of situation on the left, which is a player, and then the pipe means next to a crate. And that arrow next to the player means that the player is moving next to a crate. So when it sees that, replace it with, that's the arrow. And then the second part of that is replace it with a moving player that's next to a moving crate, which ultimately allows this pushing in any direction kind of mechanic that's ultimately manifests itself in this GIF that you can see below, how it actually works. And so I found this is a really just fantastic tool for enabling puzzle design. It has, also the similar kind of tile set focused like Bitsy does. So it makes it very easy to just quickly define levels. There's some things that it can't do well, like animation, but its programming language is very surprisingly expressive. There's a lot you can do with it. Although my students can kind of have a hard time wrapping their heads around the syntax and really kind of grasping this search and replace structure of its programming language, even just fiddling with rules and kind of finding one and finding a rule from one game and combining with another can result in kind of really kind of interesting spaces to explore. And from there, it's kind of like it's exploring like what that means, what are the opportunities when you combine those rules, and kind of fully explore like what the rule set is, and kind of demonstrating that through the levels that you create. And so on the left, on this slide shows a student's game called Eternal Dream from one of my classes. His name is Liam Day. It was a really incredible game, actually. It was all based on these invisible creatures that walk around, and you kind of have to listen to see where they are, because it's all kind of sound based, and it has this horror aesthetic. It's actually pretty terrifying for a pixelated game. Next, we have Ren'Py. So Ren'Py was released by Tom Rothamel in 2004. And it kind of was envisioned as a tool for creating visual novels. So Ren'Py is actually a portmanteau of the Japanese word Ren'Ai, which means romantic love, a common element in Ren'Py games, and Python, because it's all based, the kind of scripting language is based in Python. Ultimately, Rothamel was very interested in these kind of visual novels, and wanted to create a tool for people to create kind of more English language visual novels. And ultimately, so the kind of process here is you're kind of collecting images, writing dialogue or scripts, and then ultimately these are published as executables for Windows or Mac. So in an interview, Rothamel stated that Ren'Py is a programming language and engine that makes it easy to create visual novel style games. It allows the game maker to write the game in a simple language patterned loosely after movie scripts. And so Ren'Py's interface is actually pretty minimal. It's not really much of an interface at all. It's just a screen that's essentially a collection of links to folders and scripts that kind of define the games. So you just put the images in the right scripts, that's the right folders, and then write scripts that reference those images. So, it's not particularly user-friendly, but the scripting language is very simple, and it's designed, ultimately just to be functional. It does kind of do that job. So some sample code from Ren'Py. It's a very simple Python-based language where, not surprisingly, indentation is important. You can actually write Python scripts really easily within the engine. So on the left here, you can see that it's very easy and to write dialogue with, and that's kind of like, it actually almost looks a little bit like how you would structure a movie script or a TV script. And so you're kind of defining characters, That kind of scene background is actually referencing an image called background, like background.png. If you just have it in the right folder, it will show that background. And then the same with the characters actually. So Tommy and Slash right there are just Tommy.png and Slash.png in the right image folders. And then you can just see like you're hiding and showing different characters and different lines from each. And on the right, you can see a little bit more involved, like a kind of classic looking for you get a key and then can open a door. And so you can kind of see how variables are used in conditionals. Also really important is the concept of labels and kind of going to different labels, kind of a go-to statement to different parts of your script. So as you might expect, Ren'Py is a great tool for prototyping dialogue in games. So getting the kind of the feel of a conversation, the pacing, the flow, it's really easy to do. Also, actually, if you remove characters and just use text and imagery, it can also be good for kind of visual storytelling, or just kind of combining text and imageries. I will say that students have in the past I've included this as an option for a narrative assignment. And sometimes students think, oh, it's kind of an easy tool. It's very visual. Might be easier I'm not a great writer, so maybe I could use this. And some of those tend to be unsuccessful because there's actually more like finding the images that go with this can be challenging, or creating them. So in some ways, it can be a lot more work than you might anticipate. Next, we have Choicescript, which is a multiple choice game engine released by Adam Strong Morse and Dan Fabulich of Choice Games in 2010. So Choice Games looks like it's a company that publishes long form choice-based games. And from what it looks like, it's kind of released to help form a community around this genre of games, and also kind of discover new talent and publishing opportunities. And so it's another narrative focused tool, but one that's more focused on choice and actually in statistics as well, which I'll talk about. You can see a game here on the right called Fallen Hero Rebirth to get an idea of what kind of like the default look of a choice script looks like. And again, it also publishes ultimately to HTML. So this is from the Choice of Games website, which kind of explains why they made this engine. By creating a game system that is all about multiple choice interactions, we can focus on the choices we find interesting, moral choices, trade-offs between different values and characteristics, and so forth. So there is actually no interface, or there was, there is now, but for a while. And actually, the instructions, if you go to their download page, entails installing Node.js onto your computer and kind of using a text editor. So it's not really super easy to get up and running, although in 2016, they released an IDE that, you have to do a little bit of searching to find it, but it's definitely out there and easy to find. That basically allows you to write your code and then see the HTML, kind of the corresponding HTML, and kind of test it and have just an environment in the console for debugging. Some sample code here. So, in some ways it feels pretty similar to Ren'Py. It is indentation and labels are both very important. You can see that there this kind of like asterisk denotes any kind of command. So we have this create command for creating variables. This example kind of shows just how you could create like a leadership stat, and then kind of use that to determine that statistic to determine the outcome of an election within a game. And so you can see how we have some choices set up with the pound signs and then the if statements that show different results based on what that stat is. And so Choicescript is obviously good for a game where, as a game designer, you're really focused on making meaningful choices, or if you're an educator, really forcing your students to kind of think about these trade-offs and in particular points and meaningful choices within their games. So it is something that you can do in Twine or Ren'Py for that matter, really relatively easily, but it's really kind of front and center in the focus of Choicescript games. It's also, if we kind of look back here at the Fallen Hero, you can see there is this show stats button on that's kind of shown by default in every Choicescript game. And so then these little screenshots are kind of the result of clicking on that button. And so stats are also a really kind of important part of and easy to kind of use and start working within Choicescript. So I had a student who created a kind of a looping statistic-based game, kind of like a farming game, where you had to decide what crops you're going to plant, kind of play with trade-offs of price versus yield, and how it would affect the fields and stuff like that. And actually thinking back, like this would have been useful for the IET game where you're making these choices, this kind of repeating seasonal structure where you're deciding who to send where to what kind of jobs. It could have been useful for that. So I think any kind of statistic-based looping game could actually be quite useful for prototyping as well, or again, creating an assignment centered around that. And lastly, I've got Flick Game. So Flick Game is a tool for making minimalist point and click games created by Stephen Lavelle, who also the creator of Puzzlescript in 2015. This was actually one of 3 different games he released at the same time. These other kind of micro game engines that are kind of also worth exploring. Playing is one that's really kind of fun. You can basically draw the it's a pinball kind of a design tool where you can kind of design pinball games with this kind of painterly interface. It's a very, very constrained, genre, but it's just really kind of a fun tool. And then Tiny Choice, which is kind of like another hypertext-like tool. But so of all of the things I talked about, Flick Game is probably the simplest, the easiest. It's also the least documented. It's basically like a 16-color painting program where you can also have just 16 different frames that you can jump from kind of one drawing to the next. Ultimately, it publishes to HTML. You can see this is an example game that he gives, where you're clicking on various elements and you go to these kind of crudely drawn images. You can see, I'll show the interface. Well, first up, the design philosophy. So I couldn't really find much about Flick Game from Lavelle. I should email him about it, but it is something kind of like this quick tool that he made. That's at flickgame.org. You can find it. And this is the interface. It is, again, pretty simple, kind of looks like a paint program. We've got the brushes on the right side of the screen, different sizes. We have a fill tool and then a clear screen button. On the bottom, you have 16 colors that you can use. And then on the left side of the screen, there are the 16 frames that you can use to kind of jump between. And ultimately, all you have to, there's no code in this. You can see the numbers also underneath the colors. So what that is basically on this frame, for example, if you were to click on the red color here, it would go to frame number 2. So you're just basically assigning colors that you use to frames. So each frame, you can find what color, if you click on it, goes to what frame of those 16 that you can define. So, it's incredibly simple. this is essentially all this to the engine, but you can do a fair amount. Again, there's absolutely no code. It's just assigning numbers to colors. And so the lens here is, essentially point and click games. There are serious limitations to this. It creates only a very particular type of game, but you can prototype incredibly quickly. Like you can just sketch and just jump to different frames really easily. And that in and of itself is a pretty powerful tool to be able to make something in 5 minutes or 10 minutes. I was able to give it to my 7-year-old daughter, and she just immediately started, drawing rooms, and it was kind of her first game design development experience, which was pretty fun. Just kind of drawing rooms and linking them together and making these kind of weird connections. So, aside from creating fun experimental games, I think or like an introduction to game development, I think it also can be pretty useful for prototyping and kind of laying out point and click kind of room escape games, which a number of these kind of examples I'm showing ultimately kind of are. Like this Nailed It Here and the Alchemist Stash both have this kind of room escape vibe that they're exploring. And so that's essentially all I've got. Funnily enough, just like a week ago, I was just on Twitter and found that Everest Pipkin, who currently teaches some game courses at Carnegie Mellon, released just this huge directory of tiny tools that are searchable by tag that you can find at tinytools.directory. And so most of these, I think almost all of them are found here. There's a ton of them. And so this one, this is just a screenshot that I've selected Tiny in Game Engine. So if you're interested in these tools, I definitely highly recommend checking this out. And that's it. So, just a few thank yous. So I want to just thank Quinnipiac University for supporting me in these types of classes. Thanks to all the small game engine creators. A lot of these are just, kind of things that they want to make, labors of love. So thanks to them for making it all possible. And thanks for CSGC for having me. All right, any questions?
All right. Thank you again for being a part of CSGC 2021. So yeah, we have a few questions. So one of the questions that we have is, let me get you centered back on the screen here. Sorry about that. One of the questions we have is, do you see that one of these tools is more popular or more chosen by a student than another one, or is it just depend on the game that they're working on?
I mean, that's a good question. I've found that it really depends on the student in the class. I've had it, the Puzzlescript game, it's the only, for that assignment, the only engine that they could choose. And so that students they start hating it, and then they end up really enjoying it for the most part, figuring out a way to make it kind of their own. But the narrative assignment that I give is pretty open-ended in what tools they can use, and we have a number of tools. I give them the opportunity to use Twine, Ren'Py. I have done Bitsy in the past, and Choicescript. And so I initially did it just between Twine and Bitsy, and for those classes, everyone chose Twine, maybe just because of the ease of use, maybe because they were just familiar with it. But that is just like also kind of the easiest to just start writing and linking things. This year was different in that I did offer Ren'Py as a choice, which I hadn't, or it did in the past, but didn't quite explain the tool as much. So this time I spent some additional time to kind of explain the tool, and a number of students more students chose Ren'Py than anything. And I think it was primarily, they realized how easy it was to kind of build the game. I think was partially once I explained the interface, because it's the code, because it's actually very, very simple, even simpler than Choicescript or anything. but the games weren't quite as successful. I actually think that they were more successful when you were kind of from the narrative point of view. If I were to do it, I might just force them to choose Twine or Choicescript or something like that in the future. But I think so. Some might just depend on how much I explained and did tutorials, but others, I think, also just depends on the types of students as well.
Unmute my mic. Okay, so the next question we have: when you're transferring these games from a prototype into development, how does that transition? I guess the question is, does the prototype make for an easier transition from the student's perspective when transitioning from prototype to actual development?
So I think it definitely does. It's kind of like I mean, there's a bit of a reset that would happen, obviously, if you're using this as a prototyping tool, where you kind of have to build it up from scratch. But having gone through, I mean, the students, they build these prototypes, and then they're playtesting them. They make some revisions, and then ultimately they can kind of continue working on one of these as the final project. So I think, ultimately what it does is it helps solidify the idea, makes sure that they, testing out their theme and the flow of their narratives for that, kind of the success of their puzzle mechanics and the kind of level of difficulty, the ramping up of their levels in the Puzzlescript game. So I think it's kind of from a design perspective, figuring out what their game's about, that then once you go in, if they want to make it kind of a Unity game or an Unreal game, they have that all laid out, and they've tested and make sure that this is going to be a successful experience.
All right, and our last question is: do you have a specific favorite game engine of the ones that you talked about that you just enjoy prototyping in?
For me, it's definitely Puzzlescript. It's I just enjoy it. I think, I enjoy programming, so that's part of it. But it's a different way of thinking with when you're using the language, because it is this kind of search and replace it's structure, which I'm not used to thinking about, but it helps you kind of, because once you start embracing that and thinking about it in that way, it kind of, it really does enforce this perspective of thinking about mechanics in a different way, and that does facilitate these kind of the creation of these puzzles. It's also by far my favorite, one of my favorite assignments from this class, because I show a Jonathan Blow video where he talks about how in his creation of puzzle games, he thinks of the design process is kind of like the games design themselves, in that he comes up with an interesting rule set, and then the levels are ultimately, and the designs are ultimately kind of an articulation of that rule set, where you're kind of explaining and to the user the nuances of that rule set and what it means, and what kind of like the opportunities that rule set has. And so coupled with Puzzlescript, I think it does a really good job of, even if the students aren't completely familiar with the programming language, they can piece together a few different rules and then explore, right? Figure out what's interesting about this and how can I design levels that kind of tease apart the opportunity, the potentials of this rule set. So that's, I think, the one that I enjoy the most.
All right. Thank you again. We really appreciate you taking time out of your birthday to be here with us today at CSGC 2021. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks for having me.